Welcome to our second class on race and health. Our objectives today are to define race as a social construction, trace the history of how race and racism have shaped health and health research in US history, and to explain at least one theory of the pathways through which race and racism shape health. I do want to mention briefly a couple of things about language. I will primarily be using the language that I, as a white person, hear people of color using. So I will use the term people of color, which is an umbrella term that encompasses Black, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, Native American, or Indian groups. I primarily will use the term Black as opposed to African American, except in research that uses the term African American. And while racial oppression affects people of all racial minority groups, there is a racial hierarchy in the US in which Black Americans are often at the bottom, so I will primarily use examples of Black Americans. They do experience some of the greatest health disparities by race in this country. And I will be focusing primarily on the US context. So how does racism affect health? That is the focus of the article by David Williams that I assigned for last week. You may wonder why I assigned such an old article. This article was published in 1999. Why do you think that might be? Well, one clue is on the third page in Table 2. What did Williams point out about this data? The thing that stands out most to me is that the ratio of mortality rates between whites and African Americans is virtually unchanged from 1950 to 1995. Over the course of those 45 years, we saw the civil rights movement and profound improvements in public health. Mortality rates declined among both white Americans and Black Americans. But the gap between the mortality rate among white Americans and Black Americans didn't go away. It didn't decline. In fact, it even got a little bit wider. So if you look at that bold number, the Black-white ratio in the first row, in 1950, it's 1.55, and in 1995, it's 1.58, so marginally greater. Keep in mind that the mortality rate is per 100,000, so these rates are normalized. We're not looking at the number of deaths, but rather the rate of deaths, so deaths per 100,000 people in each group. That means that no matter how many African Americans or white people are in the population, we can compare the rates. There's another reason why I assigned this article. It's what I would call a seminal piece of research. Copy and paste the article title into Google Scholar, and you will find that it has been cited 1,227 times. I also like to point out that this is a really useful tool when you're doing research. If you're not familiar with Google Scholar, looking at the articles that have cited an article, you can click on that, and you can also look at related articles. This is also a useful piece because it lays down some very basic essential tenets of our understanding of the reasons why we see racial disparities in health. First, Williams explains what race is. So race is a social construction, meaning that it's something that humans made up. It has no real scientific basis. There is, in fact, more genetic variation within one race than there is between the races. This can be a little bit of a tricky concept, so I'm including a graphic to explain. In the first set of circles, we see the essentialist concept of race. This was the prevalent ideology of the 19th and early 20th centuries, so 1800s and early 1900s. This idea was that humans were divided into groups that shared little in common and were distinguished by physical features like skin color and facial features. In the later 20th century, the population concept of race emerged, and this idea was that races were based on genetic differences and that we shared some more genetic commonalities. So you can see in that second set of circles, they overlap more. It's now recognized, though, that any two individuals from the same race can have much more different DNA than the differences between two races as a whole. So if you look at the circles on the right, you'll see that the circles overlap a great deal. The reason I emphasize this is just because there are a lot of misconceptions that genetics explain the differences in health among populations by race. Yes, genetics do affect health, but they don't explain the large health disparities between races in the United States. Because human beings created the categories of race in order to justify slavery, though, the social construction of race has very real, tangible consequences. As Williams says, in the United States, our racial groups importantly capture differences in power, status, and resources. Racism is an ideology of inferiority used to justify unequal treatment or discrimination of members of groups identified as inferior by groups or institutions. So it's not just on an individual basis, but on an institutional level. This leads to prejudice, which is known as negative attitudes. And these negative attitudes are really persistent. So we saw in Williams' article that 45% of white Americans view Black Americans as lazy, 29% that they are unintelligent, etc. If you're curious about whether these attitudes persist today, you can actually look at the same data that Williams uses in his 1999 article and look at the more recent data. You can see the General Social Survey that Williams cites, and you can find that online. I'll include a link here. Racism does affect health via socioeconomic status, or SES. Racism was the justification for segregation that was legally enforced in the earlier 20th century. And despite some efforts to overcome it, we are still very racially segregated in US society today. So a lot of the ways that socioeconomic status mediates the relationship between racism and health have to do with segregation. And as Williams mentioned in his article, segregation was created by a number of policies and practices that were prevalent during the 20th century. One of those was restrictive covenants. So those are legally binding restrictions on property that allow people of only certain races to own that property. There also were lending practices and real estate practices that restricted where real estate agents and banks would offer housing and loans to people of color. Also, federal housing policy restricted the places where public housing was built. Segregation has led to differences in employment opportunities and education quality. And we know that employment and education are two of the strongest predictors of health. They have to do with income, opportunity, and wealth. Now, it has been thought that all of the disparities in health between white and Black Americans might be explained by differences in socioeconomic status. However, as we saw in the Williams piece, socioeconomic status cannot explain all of the disparity. Do you remember how he shows this? He separates out life expectancy by income category among whites and African Americans. I'm going to quote Williams here. At every level of income, for both men and women, African Americans have lower levels of life expectancy than their similarly situated white counterparts. You can see that in the table that I included here. So racism also has a direct relationship with health, even when we're not just looking at how it influences socioeconomic status. Racism has led to segregation, which, in addition to producing the kind of economic and educational inequalities that we associate with socioeconomic status, has also led people of color, particularly African Americans, to live in particular communities. And communities that are highly racially segregated and largely populated by Black Americans are more likely to have higher rates of crime, higher exposure to environmental hazards, poorer housing quality, and a lower availability of services. Other aspects that Williams mentions that racism might cause to influence health and create health disparities are discrimination by healthcare providers and a greater exposure to stress. Again, segregation decreases access to opportunity, education, and services. Higher income residents of segregated neighborhoods show worse health than those in integrated neighborhoods. So even if you have a higher income, a higher socioeconomic status, if you're in a segregated neighborhood, you are more likely to have poorer health than if you live in an integrated neighborhood. The lower quality of housing stock leads to health risks, and there's a higher risk of environmental pollution because where bus terminals are going to be put, where ports are, where dumping sites are, all are more likely to be in neighborhoods where people of color live. So how do we actually measure racism? One innovative study used data from online searches. They used the proportion of online searches that used the N-word in an area and compared that with the mortality rate of Black Americans. They found a significant relationship between the two, which confirms Williams' claim that racism has a negative impact on the health of Black Americans. Now, how does racism act? What does it look like? It can operate in much more insidious ways than simply calling names, like racial epithets. One example is stereotype threat. This video will explain what stereotype threat looks like.
Meet Jane. Jane is 90 kilograms and overweight. All her life, she's been told being overweight makes her unattractive. So she hides her figure by wearing baggy clothes, doesn't wear makeup, and pays no attention to her appearance. This is Mary. Mary is 54 kilograms and slim. She feels confident of the way she looks and enhances her assets by wearing makeup, tailors her dresses, and wears heels that accentuates her long legs. Wherever she goes, she makes heads turn. And here comes Tom, a man both women find attractive. Now, if you were Tom, whom would you choose? Most people would pick Mary. But why? Is it just because Mary is slim? What if Jane pays more attention to what she wears and how she carries herself? Would you pick Jane then? Overweight people are unattractive. Men are better at math. Women are bad drivers. These are familiar stereotypes. But what if you get stereotyped over and over again? Do you start to internalize the negative characteristics associated with the stereotypes and actually allow them to become self-fulfilling prophecies? This is what psychologists call stereotype threat. In 1995, American psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson put this theory of stereotype threat to the test. They conducted 4 rounds of experiments involving African American and white college students from Stanford University. Students took a difficult test in the first 2 experiments and completed a task in the third. When they were told that the test of the task was a measurement of intellectual ability, African American students performed worse than their white counterparts. However, when the tasks were described as not diagnostic of ability, their performance equaled that of their white counterparts. To reinforce the impact of the stereotype threat, the psychologists conducted the 4th experiment. Students had to fill in a personal information questionnaire before the test. The questionnaires were all identical, except that on some, the final question asked participants to indicate their race. The main aim? To see if the stereotype of African Americans being less intelligent actually affects their test score. So, how did they perform on the test when presented with feelings of stereotype threat? Those who had indicated their race before the test performed poorly. Those who did not have to indicate their race prior to the test fared better. According to Steele, an individual does not have to believe in the stereotype to be vulnerable to it. His research suggests stereotypes are self-fulfilling in nature. When a person performs badly in an area they are stereotypically supposed to be bad at, they might think the stereotype is true and perpetuate it further with bad performance. Now, if poor Jane hadn't believed that being overweight was unattractive, would she have had a little more confidence to be friends with Tom? How how about you? What stereotypes are keeping you from getting what you really want? And does the sheer belief in these stereotypes stop you in your tracks?
Have you ever heard of internalized oppression? Internalized oppression takes place when people in an oppressed group begin to believe the negative images about their group. Internalized racism causes people of color to believe negative stereotypes about themselves. In fact, when most people of color take the implicit bias test that you took last week, they have unconscious bias in favor of white people. The following video is from the doll experiments, which originated in the 1940s. Two Black psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, demonstrated with these videos that from a very young age, children internalize negative images about Black and positive images about whites. These studies were used as evidence in Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court case that made segregation illegal in public schools in 1954.
Is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and she has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
Internalized racism is associated with psychological distress, depressive symptoms, substance abuse, chronic physical health problems, and other negative health consequences. Okay, so now we know a bit about what racism is and how it operates in our society. The big question is, how does it get under the skin? Geronimus and other authors proposed the weathering hypothesis in 2006. Look for evidence of this theory in the When the Bow Breaks video I've assigned to watch after class. In this explanation, people are exposed to heightened levels of stressors due to racism. One example is the burden of Black women, who not only face oppression due to race, but also due to gender. They are more likely than white women to be the head of the household, responsible for childcare and income, in part because of the disproportionate rate of incarceration of Black men. This stress leads to high effort coping. The coping brings about high allostatic load, which is the physiological burden of that stress. It can be measured by 2 biomarkers, the hormones such as norepinephrine, cortisol, and epinephrine, and also by the biomarkers of those heightened levels of hormones, such as high blood pressure and cholesterol. These biomarkers indicate higher likelihood of illness such as heart disease. Now, there is also a role for health behaviors to play. It still has to do with racism. Here's one example using the health belief model. Black women are 30% more likely to die of breast cancer than white women. As we know, this is not because of a genetic difference. In fact, this is for similar types of breast cancer that occur in both Black and white women. Again, we see in this graphic that the mortality rate among women with breast cancer has been dropping for Black and white women, but the mortality rate of Black women is still much higher than that of white women. How could this be? Well, there are many reasons. First, Black women tend to be diagnosed later. They could be getting diagnosed later because they have lower access to health insurance and health care. They tend to receive lower quality of care. As we saw with Williams, Black people are less likely to receive numerous health interventions than white people. Black women also tend to have poorer health to begin with, before treatment for breast cancer begins. Additionally, they tend to start treatment later after diagnosis. Why might that be? Part of the reason might be access to treatment, but another reason may be explained by the health belief model. If you recall the health belief model, or HBM, perceived susceptibility and severity determine perceived threat. Together with the perceived benefits and barriers to treatment and any cues to action, these determine whether someone will complete the preventive health behavior. Perceived susceptibility is the person's belief of how likely they are to get a disease or negative health outcome. The perceived severity is their belief of how bad that disease will be for them. Typically in public health, we want to communicate that people are susceptible to a disease and that it is likely to be harmful to them because we want them to feel compelled to perform a preventive health behavior. But in this case, it turns out that Black women have seen breast cancer take such a toll on members of their community that they do have a high sense of susceptibility and severity. In fact, it's too high. The belief that the likelihood of getting breast cancer is so severe that it is very likely deadly leads some women to delay getting treatment because they believe that it will not help them. Now, this still relates to racism because it is due to the other factors that I mentioned that Black women have experienced such a disparity in breast cancer mortality, which has led to a prevailing belief of breast cancer as a death sentence. In this case, public health proponents may wish to actually educate the populations affected about the benefits of treatment and reduce their perceived severity of the disease to encourage women to seek treatment. Now, let's do a pop quiz. So, which of the following is not a policy or practice that led to racial segregation in the United States? Bank and real estate discrimination, gerrymandering, federal housing policy, and restrictive housing covenants. The answer is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the practice of changing the districts for voting, so to prevent particular people from having their vote count. If you look at maps of gerrymandering, you can see that districts have been redrawn in very creative ways that don't really make sense to try to promote particular people to be elected. Bank and real estate discrimination, federal housing policy, and restrictive housing covenants have all contributed to racial segregation in the US that persists to this day. Okay, here's another question. Fill in the blank. Belief in one's own inferiority due to racism is known as internalized, oppressive, stereotype, or generalized racism. It's internalized racism because people are making it internal. They're making it part of their own beliefs. According to the weathering hypothesis, high allostatic load is one of the ways to measure the effects of racism. What is one way of measuring allostatic load? Google searches, body temperature after exercise, heart rate, or hormones such as cortisol. The answer is hormones such as cortisol. Those can be used as a biomarker to show how much people have been exposed to stressors such as racism. Okay, finally, fill in the blank. This is the health belief model. In addition to perceived susceptibility, what factor determines perceived threat? It is perceived severity. Now we'll move on and talk about the other article I had you read, which was about the Tuskegee syphilis study. So the second article that you read for this week was by Brandt. He is a historian and he talks about Tuskegee research ethics and medical mistrust. The justification for the Tuskegee syphilis study arose from social Darwinism. You may remember Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection in the mid 1800s. The theory was that all living things evolved over time, and that the individuals with the traits best suited to survival and reproduction would pass on their genetic material to the next generation. Social Darwinists believed that the same laws of natural selection applied to the human races. This idea was popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Social Darwinists measured the features of people, like the breadth of their noses and the size of their skulls, of people on different races, and used them to make claims about the racial superiority of whites. They claimed that Black people were of inferior intelligence and were more prone to violence, crime, sexual promiscuity, physical defects, and disease. They considered Black people basically subhuman, as you can see in this quote from one of the scientists involved in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Quote, "Syphilis in the Negro is in many respects almost a different disease from syphilis in the white." End quote. Dr. J.E. Moore, 1932. Let's go over what happened in this study briefly before we talk about the repercussions. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, in coordination with the state and county health boards and the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, initiated the Tuskegee Syphilis Study to recruit Black men with syphilis in order to observe the natural course of the disease without treatment. Participants were not informed that they were part of a study, let alone asked for their permission to participate. Here is a letter from scientists operating the study to the study participants, though they did not know they were study participants. You can see that the participants were told that they were given treatment, though the scientists admitted that they never gave any adequate treatment to have any effect on the disease. Here's a few more quotes. Quote, "Should these cases be followed over a period of from 5 to 10 years, many interesting facts could be learned regarding the course and complications of untreated syphilis." End quote. Dr. Vandeleur, 1933. Quote, "We have no further interest in these patients until they die." End quote. Dr. Wenger, 1933. Well, of course, the study went on for much longer than 5 or 10 years, and many participants did die. At the time, arsenic and other toxic treatments were used to some success for syphilis, but none of these drugs were offered. In fact, the scientists conducting the study attempted to prevent participants from ever receiving any kind of treatment. They contacted local physicians and the state health board with a list of participants asking them not to treat those individuals for syphilis. They contacted the local draft board in 1941 to prevent the treatment of participants recruited for the war. Now, the entire study was in part predicated on the notion that they would never receive any kind of treatment because the Black people that they were studying, they believed weren't interested in treatment, didn't believe in treatment, and just wouldn't get any. Now, that's simply not the case because we know from Brandt's article that many of the people that they attempted to recruit for the study had already sought and received partial or complete treatment for syphilis. So people were receiving it at the time. And though arsenic and the other treatments available at the time were toxic, they did provide some protection from the disease, and they were what white people were receiving at the time. In 1943, penicillin became widely available as a treatment for syphilis. Still, no treatment or information about treatment was offered to the participants. Quote, "I hope the availability of antibiotics has not interfered too much with this project." End quote. Dr. Vandeleur, 1952. Throughout the study, findings demonstrating the impact of the disease on the study participants were reported in scientific journals, and no one raised questions about the study's ethics. Quote, "We now know where we could only surmise before that we have contributed to their ailments and shortened their lives." End quote. Dr. Wenger, 1950. Quote, racial issue was mentioned briefly, will not affect the study. Any questions can be handled by saying these people were at a point that therapy would no longer help them. They are getting better medical care than they would under any other circumstances. End quote. CDC meeting minutes, 1965. Finally, in 1972, 40 years after the study began, news got out about the research and Americans were appalled. A committee investigated the ethics of the study and determined that participants did not give informed consent. The study was halted. Though many of the study's participants had already died, those alive were given some compensation. In 1996, President Clinton issued a formal apology for the U.S. Public Health Service study. There were a number of major repercussions of the Tuskegee syphilis study. The outrage that followed led to several long-term changes. In 1974, the National Research Act established institutional review boards, which every university must use to approve all human subjects research. The Belmont Report of 1979 established guidelines for ethical human subjects research. It determined the difference between practice and research, first of all. Do you know the difference? The findings of research have a broader application to society. So this week for your assignment, which I will talk more about later, you will be interviewing a family member or friend. That might sound like research, but under these guidelines, it is not, because your interview will not be used outside of the classroom setting for your personal knowledge. Because it doesn't qualify as research, it isn't subject to the requirements for ethical research, such as informed consent. There are also some basic ethical principles that the Belmont Report established. The first is respect for persons. Persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to special protections. So, for example, prisoners, which were often used and really abused in research in the past, had to be particularly protected because their freedom was really limited. Beneficence means that not only should research not do harm, it should maximize benefits and minimize risks. And justice has to do with who ought to benefit from research and who ought to be burdened by it. Now, the applications of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice include informed consent. That requires that research subjects must comprehend the information that they're given before they decide whether to participate or not, and that they can discontinue participation at any time. So any kind of consent form needs to be at the reading level of the people who are being asked to participate, or if they can't read, it needs to be read aloud to them. It should also be in the language that they understand best. There also shouldn't be any kind of undue influence, such as a really high compensation for participation that would make it really impossible to say no to. There should be an assessment of risks and benefits, which is related to the respects for persons aspect. And the selection of participants relates to justice. So people who are disadvantaged in society can't be taken advantage of just to find out more information to benefit people who have more advantage in society. It used to be, for example, that women were not really research subjects, and so there also wasn't very much information about their health. So people also deserve to have research done in their population so that it can benefit them and their health. I want to bring up a more current example that has been considered another Tuskegee. So one of the other repercussions, aside from the development of these research ethics standards following the Tuskegee syphilis study, was that there was a lot of mistrust in Black communities for research and medical institutions. This doesn't arise from the Tuskegee syphilis study alone. There is a really long history of abuse by the medical and research community among Black Americans throughout U.S. history. Slaves were operated on for research purposes without any kind of anesthesia, during slave times. Women were forcibly sterilized by doctors throughout the 20th century because they were considered unfit mothers, because they were seen as having children too young or too often, because they were seen as mentally unstable. And so there were all of these instances of being abused by the medical community. The consequence of that is that it can sometimes be harder to get Black populations to participate in research, and it may even have consequences for their willingness to participate in healthcare. So in this instance, I want to talk about lead paint. If you have any familiarity with lead paint, you might remember that it's very toxic, and lead was commonly used in paint in toys, for houses. As you can see in this advertisement right here, it was advertised for use with things that children would be using. And lead paint was banned in 21 countries by 1921. It was recognized as being very hazardous, but the United States didn't ban it until 1978. In the 1990s, when the study that I'll talk about was taking place, 70% of Baltimore children had elevated levels of lead, and 95% of Baltimore homes contained lead. The health effects of exposure to lead include learning defects, behavior issues, nervous system damage, seizures, and even death at very high levels. The early exposures are particularly dangerous during that crucial period of development in childhood. And children are also especially vulnerable to exposure to lead paint because the way they often come in contact with it is little chips of paint off of walls that they might pick up and eat. So the Kennedy-Krieger lead paint abatement study is one in which we can really start to think about that principle of justice, the idea of informed consent, and the concept of harm reduction. We'll talk more about harm reduction in future sessions, but it is basically the idea that in some instances we might not be able to completely remove the risk of a particular health exposure or behavior. And so we might undertake to just reduce the harm, not completely get rid of it, but just reduce it. So another example of this would be needle exchange programs. Needle exchange programs don't attempt to prevent injecting drug users from the behavior of injecting intravenous drugs, but rather that they use clean, safe needles and don't share needles to reduce the risk of coming in contact with and spreading HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases. So in this case, the Kennedy-Krieger Institute lead paint abatement study had the goal of finding alternatives to full lead abatement. Full lead abatement was considered to be too expensive at $15,000 for most families to be able to afford. So they created 5 groups to test out and see if any levels of partial abatement could reduce the risk significantly of lead exposure. So they created 3 levels of partial abatement from a cost of $1,650 to $7,000. They also had a group that had full abatement and another group that was put in new homes. They encouraged landlords to rent to families with children, and they measured dust in those homes and the lead in the blood of children. So 2 children who were involved in the KKI study later sued. They both contended that they had not received proper informed consent, that KKI had not fully explained the dangers of lead paint to children in the consent form, and that they were negligent because they actually performed a study that increased rather than decreased the children's exposure to lead. This is the informed consent form. I know it's really hard to read, but I would encourage you to read this if you can to get a sense of what that looks like, in general, what a consent form looks like, but also what it looks like in this particular case as you consider whether this was ethical and just or not. So in summary, here's a few questions that you might consider regarding this study. Is the KKI lead paint study another Tuskegee? How does this affect the way that you look at research? And can we be colorblind when working as public health professionals? So, following taking the implicit bias test, a lot of people have asked, what can we do to actually combat and reduce those biases? So I have a few ideas. I got these from the Perception Institute, which is a great resource if you want to look them up. They have a lot more resources and strategies in their reports. First of all, we can de-bias. So we can try to actually reduce the bias that we hold against people based on race, sexual orientation, gender, other forms of identity. For one thing, we can do perspective taking. So we can basically try to walk a mile in their shoes, consider what it might be like to be in the position of the person or population that we are concerned with. We can use individuation to consider individual people rather than taking a group as a whole and applying a stereotype. We can also try to increase our contact with members of the group toward which we have a bias. So if we get to know more people who are from a particular race or a particular sexual orientation, for example, it becomes more difficult to harbor stereotypes toward that group as we begin to see how different each of those individuals are. In addition to trying to reduce our bias, we can try to prevent those biases that we do have from affecting our behavior. One way of doing that is doubt objectivity, and this basically means just being willing to recognize and doubt our own objectivity, to recognize that we are subjective, that we do have biases, and they might be informing the way that we are thinking and acting. We can also improve the conditions of our decision making. Think more slowly. Start to take a step back and look at the situation critically before we make a split-second decision. We can also try to reduce stereotype threat. If you recall, stereotype threat is the phenomenon in which people, when exposed to negative stereotypes about members of their group, perform negatively and actually create self-fulfilling prophecies of those negative stereotypes. One strategy here is called wise criticism. So rather than communicating low expectations, we can communicate high expectations and confidence that people will meet them. We can also encourage the idea of a growth mindset. That's the idea that it's not important where we come from so much as where we set our sights to and how much we can improve. I would love to encourage all of you to check out this episode of This American Life, The Problem We All Live With. I personally love podcasts. I don't know if any of you listen to them, but This American Life is available to listen to Saturdays on NPR on the radio. You can also download episodes on your computer or your phone. The episode, The Problem We All Live With, is a two-part series that looks at segregation in U.S. public schools and how desegregation or integration of our public schools might be a really positive solution to our failing public school system. I'd also like you to consider how Black Lives Matter, this movement, might have something to do with public health and whether it is effective. Some facts to keep in mind. In 2015, there were 990 fatal police shootings, and 494 of the victims were white. Now that's about half of the victims, but if it were proportional to how much white people make up of the population in the US, there would have been 613. Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to be killed by the police, and Black Americans are not significantly more likely to pose an imminent threat when shot by police. The level of crime in the area is also not a significant factor in whether police officers were likely to shoot and kill a civilian. So some might say Black Americans are more likely to get shot because they're posing more of a threat, they're in a dangerous neighborhood, but that actually isn't the case. And finally, US police officers shot and killed the exact same number of unarmed white people as they have unarmed Black people, and this is from 2016. That's 50 each. But because the white population is approximately 5 times larger than the Black population, that means unarmed Black Americans were 5 times as likely as unarmed white Americans to be shot and killed by a police officer. So, your assignment for this week is to interview a family member or friend about their perceptions of race and health. And you'll have the opportunity to talk to them a little bit about what you've learned this week from the lecture, from the readings, and from the video that you'll watch. I'd encourage you to watch Unnatural Causes first before you do that interview. The DVD is available at the Lake Washington Institute of Technology Library. The segment I'd like you to watch is called When the Bow Breaks. The instructions for the interview activity are available on the assignment on Canvas. And the one other component for this week is to complete the gender and health behaviors matching activity and submit your results online. The instructions for that activity are also available on the assignments on Canvas. Before next week, please read the 2 articles, Doing Gender and Constructions of Masculinity and Their Influence on Men's Well-Being, A Theory of Gender and Health. These 2 articles are a couple of my favorite, focusing on gender, gender as performance, and how the gender paradox actually privileges the health of women over the health of men, even though women in society are typically at a disadvantage. I hope that you can take what you have learned and some of the items that I brought up toward the end of lecture about Black Lives Matter, about the KKI study, into your discussions and reflections following the interview activity. And I'll be really interested to hear what you've learned and what you hear from the folks that you interview.